introduce our magnificent speaker for this evening, who's Becky Edmunds, and she is a local Sussex filmmaker and innovative artist of various in various fields and in various media. And she came across some discarded diaries and discarded journals many years ago, and then worked them up into a fantastic project, which she's going to tell us all about. But it is a most remarkable story, and I'm not going to give you any more spoilers. I'm going to let Becky take over.
Thank you, Stu, and thank you for the invitation. I am going to share my screen. Hopefully that will all go okay.
Looks good to me.
Good. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So in 1998, I was walking down a street in Brighton with a friend, and it was rubbish collection day. Everybody had put out their bins for collection. It was before there were wheelie bins in Brighton, so people used to put their bins out and the seagulls and the foxes would get at them. And there was sort of rubbish all over the street, and particularly outside one house where there seemed to be piles of stuff. And as we walked past that house, my friend Charlie looked down and said, "Oh, what's that?" And I looked down and there was a cardboard box, and it was full of notebooks, these notebooks. And there were 13 of them in total, and they were all written by one man, and his name was John Richard Perceval. There was some other paperwork as well. There was some military paperwork, and there were also a number of Christmas cards and letters and these photographs. And this is John Richard Perceval, also known as Dick Perceval. And he is the writer of these notebooks, which were journals. And the first one starts in 1925, and the last one is written in 1976. And they are an extraordinary collection of journals. They contain incredible stories, although he thought that he had a very ordinary life and was often very disappointed with how ordinary he felt his life was. It certainly didn't start out ordinary. He was born in 1909 to a very wealthy family who lived in a house called the Grange in Farnham. And this is a drawing of the house that was done by Dick Perceval's father, Sir Major General Edward Maxwell Perceval, looking very handsome there in his uniform. And this is a picture of Dick with his mother, Nora, and his older sister, Diana. He also had a half-brother called Max from his father's first marriage, and Max's mother died a couple of days after giving birth to Max. So he's 15 years old when he starts writing a diary, and he's a pupil at Charterhouse School. His first diary entry reads, "Bought a typewriter in Aldershot. Aunt Carrie sent 10 shillings, spent it on gramophone records." The plan that the family have for him is that he will go to Oxford University, hopefully on a scholarship, to study languages. And so he leaves Charterhouse School at 16 and goes to Berlin in 1925 to study on a one-year German language course to prepare for Oxford. The plan is then that he would go to work for the Foreign Office. So it's 1925, it's the height of the Weimar Republic and of the incredible culture in Berlin of that era. He comes from a very conservative family. And at the university, he meets up and makes friends with a group of people who are slightly older than him. And they take him out to the nightclubs in Berlin. He's 16 years old and he's going to gay bars and he's very confused and very shocked. And he writes in his diary about his shock and how uncomfortable it all makes him feel. And while he's there, he kind of escapes from all of that in a way. He decides that he needs to be an author. And so he stays in at night after a while to write his great novel. I think he just finds it all a little bit intimidating. He also writes that he is very much enjoying attending the university. He says that this is not, however, so much on account of my zeal for learning as for a certain wonderful little Russian girl who is also taking the course this time and whom I absolutely adore. This Russian girl is called Frida, and she is living in exile in Berlin with her mother. She's a few years older than Dick, and at first she isn't remotely interested in him, but he pursues her fairly relentlessly. He believes that love is the answer to all his problems in his life, and he's identified that problem as chiefly loneliness. And he believes that all he needs to do is meet the right woman and everything will be made right. And he is wildly in love with Frida. I think at some point she and her mother meet Dick's parents, and they both realise there might be a bit of money in the family. And so Frida becomes a lot more interested in Dick, and her mother is particularly interested that they should marry. And their relationship really blossoms while he's in Berlin. When he returns to the UK, he tells his family about Frida and his desire to marry her. And they say he's absolutely not going to marry her and that he's got to get a proper job with the Foreign Office. He refuses the Foreign Office and says he's going to get a job immediately in business. He doesn't want to go to Oxford University. He wants to earn enough money to be able to support Frida and marry her against his family's wishes. So he gets a job with a company called Steels and Co. And I don't know what they do, but he really, really hates it. He's utterly miserable and tries to think of other ways that he can possibly make money. He has ambitions. He writes, I could be famous, I know. I have got to be famous one day. But what should it be? I might be a prime minister or an ambassador or an artist or an author or an actor, but which? I rather think I should like to be a very famous author and perhaps prime minister at the same time or something like that. There is a history of being prime minister in the family. He is from the same family as Spencer Perceval, who was prime minister between 1809 and 1812 when he was assassinated in the House of Commons in the foyer. Dick decides he's going to be an author and he starts to write novels and he details the plots of these novels in his journals. He decides that his philosophy of life is romanticism, and he's completely caught up in the idea that romanticism and love will unlock life for him. He starts to write a book called Quest, which is about himself and Frida. And he also starts to write a book called The Birth of a Genius, which is also about himself, in which he is going to tell the world that he is come amongst us. He's very self-assured. He's very confident about his own genius at this stage in his life. Dick writes to Frida obsessively, almost every evening. But by 1929, his passion has cooled and he's beginning to think that perhaps he shouldn't marry Frida. And one day, perhaps sensing this, Frida demands that he place an announcement of their engagement in a major London newspaper. He decides to put it in the Daily Herald, which is a socialist newspaper, safe in the knowledge that none of his family or anyone that he knows will ever read it. To be on the safe side, he puts it in German. In 1931, another woman walks into his life and changes everything for him forever. At this point, he has left Steele's and Company and he has gone into publishing. And he is working at this point for Colour magazine, which is an arts magazine and which has the fabulous tagline, "The most fascinating magazine in the world." He's working in the office of Colour one day, and this is what he writes. He says, "I wish I were not so tired, for I have much that I want to write about tonight. I have been having a strange experience yesterday and today. I think I have fallen in love again, but it is a more hopeless love than ever. She is a wonderfully attractive young German girl, and alas, she is married. Her name is Serena Eicher, and since she came into the office yesterday, I have been unable to think of anything other than her." Serena Eicher, she's not only married, she has 3 sons, the oldest of whom is just a couple of years younger than Dick. This wonderfully attractive young German girl is in fact about 44 years old, and he is 22 at the time. But this doesn't put him off at all. He is absolutely obsessively in love with Serena. She seemingly tries to put him off and tells him that it's no good because of the age difference, but it makes no difference to him at all. She's quite a mysterious character. She will sometimes disappear just without telling him and go away for months and then show up again without any kind of communication. So she is often breaking his heart. She can be quite cruel to him, and he often writes that she is dismissive and thoughtless. At some point, she gets a divorce from her husband, and Dick is absolutely ecstatic, but then she gets engaged to someone else, a man called Fritz Erbs, who lives in Berlin, who I think is quite a bit older than she is. But this doesn't stop the relationship between her and Dick Perceval. At one point, he writes that Fritz Erbs is in a sanatorium somewhere because he has slit his own throat because Serena doesn't love him enough. Serena eventually goes on to marry Fritz Erbs. Colour magazine, the most fascinating magazine in the world, closes fairly swiftly after Dick starts working there, and he goes on to work at the European Herald. It's a hopeful publication that was advocating for a united Europe, and Dick was passionately pro-European. He had a real love for mainland Europe and particularly for Germany. Then out of the blue, Dick was offered a job in Singapore with the Singapore Free Press. And when he left the European Herald, the paper's cartoonist created this in his honour. Dick leaves the UK in 1935, and on the way he stops off in Berlin to visit Serena and her new husband. I think the husband knows about the relationship and has kind of accepted it. Dick writes in great detail about the boat journey to Singapore and the people who he is travelling with. And there's this really interesting thing about the notebooks that as he reaches the end of one notebook on this boat journey, he was sort of halfway through a paragraph describing the purser of the ship. And he gets to the end of the page, the last page in this notebook, and he writes continued in next volume. But I don't have that volume. That volume is missing from the collection. And so the next volume I have starts in 1937, and Dick has left Singapore and is now on a round the world trip with Serena, who came and joined him in Singapore at some point. Seemingly, she divorced Fritz Ebbs because on the 30th of September 1936, she and Dick Perceval are married in Singapore. And so they leave on this round the world trip. They're stopping off in all sorts of amazing places in the Far East. They go all the way, they travel across America. And he writes in great detail about the trip and the places he visits, but he barely writes about Serena, except to say that the marriage is difficult and not what he had imagined married life would be. They return to the UK at the end of 1937, and he and Serena get a flat in London. His family are absolutely horrified that he has married Serena. Dick and Serena were actually married for 23 years, and I don't think she ever met any member of his family. I think they just refused. Dick was cut off at that point from any family finances. He was just written out of the deal. They didn't want Serena to get anything. So he was now on his own with a wife to support, and she was a wife who really liked spending money. She really liked the good life. He gets a job with the Amalgamated Press, but it doesn't last long. He's fired after he asks for a pay rise. And then he gets a job with Reuters, but then it's the outbreak of World War II, and Reuters are having to reduce their costs. And so as he was the last member of staff in, he is the first out. On September the 3rd, 1939, he's sitting in his room listening to the radio, waiting for the Prime Minister to announce the outbreak of war. He says, in a quarter of an hour, we shall all turn on our wireless sets to hear the Prime Minister speak to the nation on this beautiful morning. And then we shall learn at last the answer to the question that has been on everyone's lips for more than a week. Is it war or peace? But nobody any longer doubts that the answer will be war. One is filled with an immense sadness. And then he doesn't write for a while. And the next diary entry begins like this.
May 7th, 1940, at Bletchley. By tomorrow, I shall have been living and working at Bletchley for exactly a month. It has been a happy month, the happiest I have spent since I last wrote in this diary on the day that the war began. How long ago that day seems now. Yet everything that happened before that day seems not only to belong to the long ago, but to some other life. Things which one did last summer, or even last autumn, seem to have happened ages and ages ago. Although the course of this war up till now has been contrary to all the predictions of the experts, one is steeped with a sickening awareness of it most of the while. For me, it has meant that I have not seen Serena for over 7 months, and I do not think I am likely to see her again until this war has ended. Serena left London to go and live in Switzerland a week before the war was declared. She is still there. She wanted to be in a neutral country in the event of war breaking out, so that she might keep in touch with her sons in Germany as well as with me. I was very sad that she wished to go. It left me to face the war alone, at a time when the blessing of a loving wife would have meant so much to me. But I tried to realize the difficulties of Serena's position too, her feelings, her love for her sons. And I knew that in the event of a war, her sympathies would lie with Germany rather than with my country.
So when World War II breaks out, Dick is unemployed and living alone in London. He feels very much under pressure to volunteer to fight. His family are quite persuasive. He writes, "I think Max thought I ought to volunteer and that it would be a good idea for me to join the gunners. I then went down to Farnham the next day to consult my people. Neither my mother nor my father had any hesitation in stating that they thought I ought to volunteer. I suppose it was largely a matter of family pride on their part, but it did seem to me somewhat heartless that they should have no reticence whatever in seeing me plunged into a life that must necessarily be odious to me and which might so well mean my death." Dick joins up because he feels he's got no other options. And he's very shocked when he does join up at the kind of life that he is now leading. It's the first time that he's really had any contact with people from any other social background to himself. And he writes that he's horrified by all the swearing and how coarse it all is. And up until that moment, he'd been living a very privileged life, and he finds himself sleeping on the floor of an old scout hut in Clapham Common during his training. But after a while, he starts to write very movingly about how all these men that he's working with have started to call him pal and mate and chum and brother. And no one's ever called him that before. And so he changes during this time in the army. And then amazingly, after a few months, he's called up to the War Office. He's interviewed by someone for a job, and he has no idea what the job is or why they've got in touch with him or how they found him. But as a result of that interview, he is recruited into Bletchley Park, and he goes there in 1940. The journal that he keeps while he's there is an extraordinary document. He can't say what it is that he's doing. Obviously, it's top secret work. We do know that he is working in Hut 3 with a group of linguists, and I believe that he was probably working as a translator. But he can't write about any of it really, but he does write about the atmosphere at Bletchley, and he writes about the experience of being there. He writes about how challenging it is to be doing shift work because Bletchley Park is just going all the time, and he's on shift work. And he also writes about the loneliness of not being with his wife. At one point, he's actually hospitalized as a result of mental health problems. He starts suffering from sleep paralysis and night terrors, and he believes that it's all caused by the shift patterns at Bletchley. But he remains at Bletchley until the end of the war, when he is posted to Hamburg as part of the Control Commission. There he is reunited with Serena. In 1949, he writes, "The fact that I have written nothing further in this diary for nearly 2 years is itself the most eloquent expression of the life that I have led during those years. It seems to me as though my work and my marriage have combined to hold me prisoner and deprive me of real living. Sometimes I think it is only during the half-hour walks between my office and my flat that I have any sense of peace and happiness and of finding myself at last for a little while. This is no doubt a great exaggeration, yet these walks, and I prefer to walk rather than drive in the car they put at my disposal. These walks are for me a symbolic bridge between my working life in the office and my married home life in my flat. Both lives are dreadfully unsatisfactory. Dick and Serena returned to the UK at the end of 1949 as Dick has a new job. He begins to work with the BBC monitoring service, and the monitoring service listens to broadcasts and propaganda from different countries from all over the world and then writes reports for government. And so Dick worked as a report writer. And frankly, he's very disappointed that that's what he does for a job and that he hasn't written his novel. He tried to write a travel book about his trip around the world, but it didn't get published. But he's happy that the job comes with a pension and a bit of security. He and Serena live in a flat in London, and he really doesn't write much. Throughout the whole of the 1950s, he doesn't write much at all. He only writes on really big occasions. And so he writes very movingly when his mother dies. And he tells about how that relationship was really profoundly damaged by his marriage to Serena. He also writes on the death of his father. And then in 1960, he writes on the occasion of Serena's death.
Kent House, Kensington Court. February the 19th, 1960. 4 weeks ago tomorrow, on Saturday the 23rd of January, my dear Serena died, suddenly and peacefully, as the result of a heart attack, between 10:15 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. in her bedroom here and in my arms, at the end of what had been an exceptionally happy day for her. I usually work on Saturdays, but, providentially, I had arranged to have that one off in order to take Serena to the wedding of Anthony's daughter. So I was with Serena throughout her last day. And I'm glad to know that on her last day in this world, Serena attended a service in the Catholic Church, for she had been brought up as a Catholic and always regarded herself as one, even though the circumstances of her life had taken her outside the Catholic Church's fold. So she had a certain spiritual happiness at attending this wedding service that day. And afterwards, she greatly enjoyed the wedding reception, where we met a number of my other cousins, as well as Max and Dorothy. Serena always loved this kind of occasion, and she was in excellent spirits throughout it. She died shortly after our return home that night. Although she had suffered a heart attack and told me to tell the doctor this when I telephoned him, I am certain that she did not suffer any actual pain. She suddenly became utterly exhausted, and I do not think she knew that she was going to die. This happened while we were waiting for the doctor, and I do not know myself at what moment it happened, for it all passed so peacefully. As she lay there, dead in her bed, Serena looked wonderfully peaceful and about 20 years younger. It was rather lovely to see that. She was, in fact, 72 on her last birthday.
Dick doesn't write much after Serena dies. He begins to write again in 1964. And he says, "It is with great hesitation that I start writing a journal again after an interval of about 3 years, I believe. I have had little time and less inclination to do this, although much that is of great importance to me has happened during these years. On the 5th of September, 1961, I married again. I married Sheila, whom I had known for some years previously at the BBC, where she had also worked before our marriage. It has been a most happy marriage and a great blessing in my life. This followed as a natural course of events, as though predestined after my darling Serena's death. It was only a question of when I would be ready to marry again after that. And this is Dick and Sheila. And their marriage was a really very, very happy one. Sheila really loved him, and I think he felt it was the first time that he'd ever really, truly been loved. And it brought him great joy. He absolutely adored Sheila. They were a great couple. He retired from the BBC and they moved briefly to Torquay before eventually moving down to Brighton. They lived in Brunswick Square until some students moved into the flat above, and then they had to move out. And then they moved to Rochester Gardens, which is near Palmyra Square, for those of you in Brighton. Dick did freelance work, a little bit of freelance work as a translator. And he often wrote about how much he missed London and complained that he found Hove rather dull. One day, when Sheila goes to visit her parents, Dick decides it's time that he read Serena's diaries, which he has had since her death. The diaries document her early life, and as he reads them, he begins to wonder if he should perhaps have them published in Germany as a memorial to her. But as he reads on, he has a great shock. When she reaches the part about their life together in Singapore, she writes very cruelly about him.
But throughout all these diaries relating to our life in the East, whenever she makes any reference to me, it is always derogatory and unkind, often even cruel. In contrast to this, the diaries are full of the most wonderful praises for Fritz Erbes, stating what a wonderful man he was, how much she loved him and missed him, and how he would always be the only man in her life. Why then did she leave him of her own will to come to me? What made all her unkind references to me even more hurtful was the fact that all these diaries were actually written for Fritz. As each volume was completed, as she records, she posted it back to him in Berlin, for him to keep them all for her and return to her once she got back to Europe, which she did.
In 1975, Dick was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he has surgery to remove part of his left lung. He writes very movingly about how terrified he is and what a horrible shock it is. He doesn't want anyone to visit him in the hospital because he feels that it's all his own fault because he's been a very enthusiastic smoker his whole life. He has the surgery and recovers, and the diaries end in 1976. When we found these diaries in 1998, we didn't have any easy access to the internet. That was the year that Google started, so it wasn't easy to search to find out who Dick Perceval was. So we read the diaries. We were really interested in the diaries, but then they were put away for 20 years until I could find a way to make them public. In 2018, I received a research grant from Arts Council England to explore the journals more. And it was at that point that I could access more information online. I had assumed that Dick had died of lung cancer in 1976, But once I had access to Ancestry, I discovered that he actually died in 1997, a year before the diaries were found. Now, I don't know if he stopped writing diaries or if there was another cardboard box full of notebooks that I didn't see in that pile of rubbish. It might have been, though, that he stopped writing diaries. He did say that he was beginning to wonder why he continued to do it. The film clips that you have been seeing are from a web series that I created. And I used archive footage to try and bring Dick's story back to life. I found this footage in a range of archives. I use old copyright-free Hollywood movies, public information films, cine club movies, so amateur film enthusiast movies. I used the British Council archive, and I also worked in collaboration with Screen Archive South East, who supported the project with some of their incredible footage from their archive. They have a great archive of home movie footage, amongst other things. And so I created 27 short films that were released throughout the year of 2020. So to do this, this is Dick standing in front of a portrait of himself. To do this, I had to contact the family because I had no right to use the diaries. Even though they'd been thrown away, the copyright still rested with Dick Perceval and therefore had been passed down through his family. But Dick had no children, and nor did Max. But his sister Diana had 2 children, David and Amanda. And I managed to trace one of David's daughters. I got an email address for her and wrote her an email basically saying, hello, I found your great uncle's diaries in a pile of rubbish and they're really great and I'd really like to make them public, and sent it off. She replied, I want to thank you wholeheartedly for tracking me down. I always wondered what had happened to his journals and assumed that they had been destroyed when he died. I can't imagine how they ended up on the street, although that would have been around the time of his final illness, a move into nursing care, and his death. Thank you for finding them and saving them. Uncle Dick was an extraordinary man. The opportunity to learn more about his earlier life would be a real gift. I am sitting here a little stunned, quite in a mess of tears at the possibility. So Katie gave me permission to use the diaries, and she also gave me a whole load of photographs, including this one that she had, and family stories about Dick Perceval. And it was very interesting to speak to a member of his family and realise that I actually knew a lot more about their family member in a way, because I knew what was inside his head. We also managed to track down further information through the BBC Monitoring Service archive. The producer that I worked with on the project contacted them and said, this man worked for the monitoring service. Do you have any information about him? And they said there won't be anything because we only keep 3% of our staff files. And it's unlikely he'll be there, but we'll check. And they checked and it was there. His staff file had been kept and was an incredible journey into a whole different side of him. It was very much an opportunity for me to kind of read other people's opinions about Dick Perceval. And I mean, everything had been kept. They'd kept his very first letter that he ever wrote to the BBC in 1928, trying to get a job. He auditioned for various reading jobs for the BBC, never got anywhere. But yeah, the BBC archive was really, really fascinating. And then another source of information was a person who turns up in the later diaries, who Dick refers to as Putsy. And actually, I don't know what her real name is. She introduced herself to me as Putsy. Putsy was the daughter of a woman called Gina Brennan, who is the artist who painted this picture that Dick is standing in front of in this image. She was an American woman, and Dick fell deeply in love with her, as he would with women, in 1934. They spent a week together. He never got over it. He always wished that he'd married Gina, but it wasn't to be. And Putsy is Gina's daughter, who moved to London and got in touch with Dick Perceval when she moved there, and they became very close. He was a bit of a father figure to her. And while I was looking through some of the paperwork that came with the diaries, I actually found an address for her, and I wrote her a letter to this address from the 70s, just to see if it would land with anyone. And the people who lived there forwarded it to her. And so one day I got a phone call from Putsy, and she was really thrilled that the diaries had been found. She invited me over for a very nice lunch, and she handed over a collection of love letters that Dick had written to her mother over the years, and she gave them to me. I also managed to track down letters from Serena, although they're all written in a very, very archaic form of German, so they're quite hard to decipher and translate. But they were part of a collection called the Bletchley Letters, and they were exhibited at Bletchley Park in 2008, a collection of letters between Dick Perceval and Serena. And so all of this became this series, which is all online. It's completely free to access. There are 27 episodes. It starts with January the 1st, and January the 1st is 3 different diary entries written on January the 1st from different years. And the project unfolds like that. So the next one is January the 7th, and there's 2 different episodes, diary entries, I think, in that episode. So we travel forward through a year, but back and forward through time in the series. There is also a blog page with lots more information about searching for evidence, diary entries that didn't make it into the series, extra information that I found. And the whole series is available. You don't have to sign up for anything. You don't have to pay for anything. It's just sitting there waiting to be watched at www.tobecontinuedonline. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Becky. That was a fantastic and actually at times really quite affecting talk.